All right, I think we can get going now. So it's great to have everyone here and virtually on campus. And it's great to have Ken Chenault, class of 73, with us for a conversation today. There is a lot to talk about. Ken, thank you for being here with us and for taking the time out of an incredibly busy schedule.
Glad to be here, Clayton.
I will introduce Ken in a moment, but a couple of quick logistical matters. I will start, as we usually do these things, and take the first 10, 12 minutes or so and offer up a few questions to get us warmed up. I will give you a chance to put questions into the Q&A function on Zoom here. I suspect you are all intimately familiar with how that works by now. The chat function's been disabled, so use the Q&A function if you would. And I will curate those questions, and we'll try to get to as many and many different kinds in the hour that we have with Ken. Ken really needs no introduction. He is one of the most consequential leaders in America in the last half of the last century and in this century. His leadership at American Express is legendary. He was the CEO there for 16 years, worked there for 37 years, and was described there were many remarkable comments were made about his tenure as the leader of that company, but he was described by one as the best CEO of his generation. Very shortly after assuming the leadership there, the attacks on the Twin Towers took place on 9/11. American Express's headquarters were right across the street from the Twin Towers, and American Express lost 11 colleagues that day. And their headquarters were badly damaged. Ken's careful and humane stewardship of the company, of the customers, of employees during this incredibly traumatic and historic, demanding period was widely studied, written about, and today continues to be one of the things that is taught in business schools around the world. He has had enormous influence in corporate America, but also far and wide beyond the boardroom. He has advised presidents, and he's helped to create or strengthen and sustain some of our most important philanthropic and cultural institutions. In particular, he was instrumental in the creation of the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of African American History and Culture. And he served as a member of our board between 1986 and 1993. Today, he's made this seamless transition from the old economy, leading one of the giant companies in America that was founded in the mid-19th century, to being a central player in the new economy as the chair and managing director of General Catalyst, a venture capital and private equity firm, and someone deeply steeped in the work of Silicon Valley. Ken's BA was in history. He earned it magna cum laude, and he wrote his thesis on issues of race at Bowdoin, and it was entitled "The Black Man at Bowdoin." And I suspect that we will turn to that shortly and talk a little bit about that. He and his wife, Catherine, have been married since 1977, and they have 2 sons who are, I think, off in the world now. Ken, or is one still in school? Yeah, off in the world. So Ken, again, welcome, and thank you for taking the time to be with us today. I'm sorry we're not in Pickard Theater, but here we are.
Here, Clayton.
So let's jump into the deep end of the pool here and talk a little about the issues facing our country from a political and democratic perspective. President Trump has, as recently as yesterday, refused to concede the election and claims that he won in his 46 or 47-minute pre-recorded speech he gave from the White House. Can you share with us how you think about the position that the president has taken? What, if anything, worries you about that? What challenges you think it presents for democracy here in this country, and challenges for the president-elect, Joe Biden, in what he will have to do when he assumes office and his leadership and ability to govern?
Clayton, in response to your points, I agree with all the points. That one, I think what's very important, and let me step back. I think one that we have to recognize is 80 million people voted for Joe Biden, but 74 million people voted for Donald Trump. So there obviously the largest number aside from Joe Biden that ever voted in a presidential election. And probably a decent percentage of those people voted for Obama at some point. So this whole situation is very bizarre. For me, what I think is very fundamental about our country is their core values of character and behavior that I don't think we're emphasizing enough. And I think that President Trump's behavior clearly is damaging to our democracy. I think what he has been very successful at is obfuscating the truth. And so fake news, which people laughed at that effort when he started it, has been incredibly effective. And I think when we're in a situation where we're arguing about facts that are ascertainable, that's very different from arguing about political ideology. And I must say, I think that for our democracy to operate successfully, I think there needs to be involvement from both sides of the political aisle, calling him out and his behavior. And there are a few Republicans who are doing that. I also think the business community shouldn't get a pass here. It's not an issue of attacking an ideology, but it's what our country stands for. I think it makes Joe Biden's job more difficult. I think that I believe he is focused on trying to bring people together. But I must say, I'm at my wit's end of figuring out how to address this issue. And the only way, I believe, is there has to be, at the leadership level of the public and private sector, which I do not believe is occurring, is I do think we need to have a reframing of what does America stand for? What's the role that business needs to play, government needs to play? What responsibility do we have? And we're in a situation now where leaders are going to the sidelines. And I think they got to be in the ring, because I really do believe we're fighting for the soul of this nation.
So let me ask two follow-up questions to that, Ken. Thank you for that. What do you think is happening that's causing the leaders to go to the sidelines here and not to get into the middle of this?
You know, when I talk to Republicans and Democrats, some in private, what they will say to me is, in some instances, Ken, you're being naive. We're going to be slaughtered if we speak out. My view is that what I believe we have to acknowledge is there are broad segments of our population that are feeling that they've been ignored and no one cares about them. And so anyone who says, I'm aligned with you, and it's the other person that's the issue, people are responding to that. And as I said, I think what has to happen is there needs to be a reframing of what are the roles and responsibilities of companies, the roles and responsibilities of government. I think what's starting to happen, Clayton, a little bit, and it's small steps, but I think you'll see more of it, is more active dialogue between individuals in the private sector and the public sector about things that they need to do together. And there are different thought groups now that are emerging that really recognize we got to reassert what America stands for and what the values are. But I think that what we need to be very clear-eyed about is we have vast segments of our population that are feeling disenfranchised. And we've got to figure out a way to address that, and we've got to go out and talk to them. And that can't happen just every 2 years or 4 years in an election cycle, because then we're giving it over to all the fringe groups.
Yeah. So just to stay on the broader challenge of kind of rhetoric and challenges right now that we're facing, how you've spent your career traveling the world, you have done business in most countries, you know many leaders. How does what's going on here play overseas? And what's the implication for what's happened here and happening here for the standing of America? What do you worry about? What are you seeing?
I think we've lost some credibility. I am not as pessimistic as some that we can't regain it, because I think what is important, while some people are surprised, and one of the things that we need to recognize, there's some parts of the world where Donald Trump has a very strong fan base in a very targeted way in a number of countries around the world. But I think people really felt that our democracy and our norms of behavior were strong enough to withstand what's going on now. And I think that America needs to recapture the high ground. I would say that, in my view, and this is anecdotal, went through a period of time where I had a number of colleagues and friends around the world who would say, what's happening to the country? But on the same token, what I've also heard is we need America to stand out. The world needs America, and they want us to be strong. And I think that gives me a level of optimism that a number of the steps can be taken to repair the damage that, frankly, I believe was caused by the Trump administration.
I'm going to, we've got some questions coming in, and I'm going to turn to one of them that's relevant to this, and I promise we'll come back to the others as well, to those that have asked. But Kevin asks, why does it seem that the disenfranchisement seems to be more in the rural areas of the country than the urban population centers?
Yeah, I think what I would say is I think the disenfranchisement is in both, but I absolutely agree with you, Kevin, that in the rural side, I think particularly when you look at what's happened to the manufacturing and the agricultural sectors, they've been ravaged. The epidemic of drugs, I mean, as we all know, I was class of 73 at Bowdoin. When you went around the country, whether it was Maine, Vermont, it was just this incredible atmosphere. Now there are a number of places that have just been ravaged. And obviously that's true across the country. And I think this goes to, are people feeling listened to? And are people feeling that the power structure really cares about them? And I really fundamentally believe that there has been a view as we moved from a agriculture, manufacturing to a service economy, that I think in some places the attitude was those folks are going to just be left behind. And I think that we need to understand that there are sets of issues that our rural communities face that need specific remedies that have to be addressed.
All right, thank you. So let's pivot now. Maybe we'll turn to the corporate world. And Jeff Emerson has asked a question here. What's your opinion of the NASDAQ proposed requirement that its listed members' boards contain at least one female and one underrepresented minority member or LGBTQ person on their board?
So I think, look, what's very important is an understanding, and this is my view, that corporations exist because society allows them to exist. And corporations have a responsibility to improve society. Clearly, diversity, inclusion is very, very important. And I think that if standards are put in place for governance in a range of areas, institutions that put in standards for diversity, I think that is their right to do that. And I think it is important to have boards and management teams that are reflective of the broader society that we live in. And it can't just be lip service. So I frankly need to get a better understanding of how NASDAQ is going to implement this. I haven't had the time to take a look at it, so I can't give you a more informed answer than the one I just gave you.
Would you, just to follow up on that, Ken, would you feel as a CEO or a board member, and whichever place you want to think about it, put upon that the NYSE or the NASDAQ would put this requirement in place and essentially create a block if you didn't do it to going public?
You know, what's happened increasingly, Clayton, if we look at it, is that some of the major funds, right, are saying they're going to take a much closer look at steps that are being taken in social responsibility. That's certainly putting more pressure on CEOs. From my perspective, my preference would be that I had the responsibility to put together a diverse board without being told what constituted fully a diverse board. And that's why I said I need to take a look at what NASDAQ defines as a diverse board. And then what's very important is, what is the impact then? And I think that clearly the view is that the progress has been insufficient. And I think that's also what needs to be weighed.
Yeah. Just staying with kind of corporate governance for a minute or two here. I've lost track of time in the COVID era, but about a year ago, the Business Roundtable made a fairly dramatic shift from an explicit statement of what it believes the responsibilities of an organization of business are, a corporation, from being shareholder focused to being stakeholder focused. Can you just talk for a minute or two about, first of all, your own sense of what it is that they did, what the Business Roundtable did, and then how you think about the implications of that and how you thought about that? Were you a shareholder-focused CEO, a stakeholder-focused CEO? How do you advise the CEOs you advise now? So a couple of tiers of questions in there.
Let me start a little bit with my perspective. I was a stakeholder-focused CEO, but I was driven by a pretty fundamental belief that I tried to ensure that the strategies and the culture that we tried to put in place would reinforce this. Is I want to build an enduring company. And what I felt very strongly about is to build an enduring company, we need a well-functioning society. And so American Express, now it's a 170-year-old company. You can't take the position, I'm going to divorce myself from what happens in the broader society. You've got to get involved. So fundamentally, I believe that my role as CEO is to manage the tensions between all the stakeholder groups. And it is not an either-or situation. It's not a zero-sum game at all. What I think is very important about the Business Roundtable, because they represent a large percentage of the Fortune 500 companies, is to get a group with those many companies, those many political views, to align on a philosophical position was major. I would say there were a number of CEOs similar to me who believed in stakeholder management and had been very focused on it. But I think it was very important that the statement was made. Now, those are words. So what are the actions being taken? But I think it was a very important step and a recognition of what I was saying earlier, of corporations increasingly understanding the role that they needed to play and need to play to have a healthy, productive society. So I see that as very encouraging. I also think what's important, and some of the drivers were not just positive drivers, but I think people looked at, for example, the Gallup poll, and if I recall this correctly, someone can check, I think American baby boomers, I think it was 32% said they favored socialism, and 49% of millennials and Gen Xers favored socialism. So I want to be very clear. I am a capitalist. I believe very strong in capitalism. But I also believe that capitalism must demonstrate that it will be beneficial to all segments of our society. And with any evolution of business, roles and responsibilities evolve. And I think that's what has to happen now.
Thank you for that, Ken. I have a question here from a classmate of yours, Alan Christenfeld.
Yeah, how you doing, Alan?
It's about New York City. And the period after 9/11 was very difficult on New York, as you know, better than virtually anyone. And the city had to rebuild itself. You were at the center of much of that effort. As Alan points out, it is again, the city's again peering into an abyss, to use his term here. What steps do you think cities in general and New York City in particular need to take to restore themselves to health? And then second question is, are you planning to resume a corporate leadership role in those efforts? He's an advocate for that view, but
right.
That's the question.
So Alan, really good to hear from you. I remember you very well. You know, let me say what I've said to various CEOs, and I actually said to my successor, Steve Squeri, who I think is doing a terrific job, that what we're going through, and 9/11 was an incredible challenge, and the financial crisis was an incredible challenge, but this is something that is unimaginable that we're all going through. I think for the cities as the world, you've got to start with the basics. Is first we need to get the vaccine out there, and because it's safety and security, I think that's got to be the focus. But I think for New York City, as I try to take some lessons learned, I think one, very importantly, is people are going to have to feel that their safety and security in the city is going to be enhanced. People now, particularly affluent people, and this goes to the income inequality issue and the haves and have-nots. The concern is that some of the affluent people are saying, I can actually work remotely, or maybe I'll go back to working 50% remotely, and maybe I don't need a place in the city. And so part of what I think we need to do, and I'd use New York City as an example, is we've got to focus on safety and security. We've got to focus on the unbelievable journey we've had, and we're still on, and we have a lot of work to do of improving our educational system. Because if people are going to come back, we've got to really say, this is going to be a very high priority for us. I think we've got to focus on how we revitalize the economy. How do we encourage businesses to stay in the city? And this is going to get back into the tricky area of what incentives do you give people? What is the balance of that? But I think we've got to create an environment where companies really feel that there's an opportunity to be in the city. And we've got to really encourage that. I think we've got to have a major set of initiatives against small business, because New York City is an incredibly entrepreneurial place. I think we got to continue to support and build up the arts and our cultural institutions, because I think that's one of the things that makes New York City great, our entertainment venues, our cultural venues. So I think, frankly, if I had to summarize it, and given the time that we have, I think we got to have a Marshall Plan for our cities. But then back to the person's question earlier, I think that also needs to be complemented by a Marshall Plan for rural America. So it can't be an either or situation. So I think that the level of public and private funding required and the need to put together innovative private-public partnerships is absolutely essential.
Sorry, I was on mute there. I want to switch gears here to a little bit about the Silicon Valley, but a question that Judith Lester has. Social media has a large role as a platform for mis- and disinformation in the political world. Given that social media is self-regulated, do you think this will change without some sort of regulatory oversight? So large issue across the board for so many companies. So.
Big issue, which we could talk hours about. This is one, frankly, I struggle with, and I'll give you what my current thinking is. And this goes to, I think, a very important attribute that I am looking for in the companies that we invest in at General Catalyst. And one of the things I talk about a lot for technology is, as I said earlier, anything I'm involved with, I want to make sure is enduring. But I think it's very important that we have a higher level of what I call mindfulness of impact. Given all the progress in technology, it is not enough to simply say, I'm going to disrupt, without actually thinking through some of the consequences and the second and third and fourth order impacts. Because I think technology should be an enabler. It can do more to drive real positive change. And I think the issue of disinformation and misinformation, one of the things I think has to happen in all of our educational institutions is I think we got to figure out how we can drive a greater level of what I call media literacy. That needs to happen. I have come to the conclusion, and it's a balancing, but I think the government is going to have to get more involved in what some of the standards are. I don't think they should overcompensate. I don't think they should overregulate, but I do believe that just as there are laws and regulations governing publishers, we're going to need to look at something that bears some similarities for social media. And the power is substantial that these companies have. I don't think anyone 20 years ago imagined that things would evolve and move as quickly as they have. So if you think about it, all of the checks and balances from an institutional and what role the government and the private sector, whatever, really didn't have a chance to adapt. And this really is an area that I believe you've got to have the private sector and the public sector working together. But I do think some of the consequences as we've seen throughout our history for technology, is an understanding that there's got to be a balance of government regulation and private sector ownership and responsibility. And so I think this is one of the most challenging issues of our time. And again, I don't think we're addressing it in a comprehensive way. And if we look at what's happened on the political side, neither party is really looking at this holistically. They're looking at it principally through the lens of their own self-interest.
Just to pick up on that point and some of the conversation from earlier, Ken, do you have some optimism that we will, that bridge will be crossed and we'll get to some reasonable partnership and thoughtfulness, or more pessimistic?
I'm probably a little bit more pessimistic, Clayton.
Yeah.
I wish, and I'm an optimist by nature. I go back, and this may be naive on my part, but I really think that if we were able to get it, and it just doesn't have to be in the US, some thought leadership by a few people in the private sector and in government trying to work out some frameworks, I think the impact could be tremendous. So that's my hope.
Yeah.
But what I'm concerned about is the level of openness to really confront these challenges without pointing fingers and stifling real effort to bring about change.
Yeah. Roman Jackson asked the following question. During economic down cycles, we typically see that generation of young people experience the greatest challenge to economic mobility. How do we ensure that they're included as we think through the recovery here now? So first, I guess, do you think that's where this recovery will leave the youngest behind, or do you worry about another sector? And then what do you think needs to be done here?
Yeah, so what I would say is it depends on the segment you're talking about. What I've seen in downturns, if I go to the financial crisis or 9/11, for the upwardly mobile, so the students at Bowdoin, they will go through some challenges for the next year or two, but they're not going to be forgotten. I think what is clearly going to happen for a number of people is they're going to have opportunities. What I'm more concerned about are the disenfranchised, the people, whether it not just people of color, Blacks, Latinx, et cetera. I'm concerned about white lower class, poverty level, rural. The level of retraining that will need to take place is enormous. And if we look at what's happening with COVID in our educational system, the upper middle class has coping capability to ensure that their children are going to get through this. And yes, it's very, very tough for them, but they're going to get through it. But there are large swaths of our population that are going to have a real challenge coming back. So part of what we've got to do is we've got to go through an assessment, which I think is what you're saying, of who really is being hurt, who's being left behind, where were the gaps pre-COVID, where are the gaps post-COVID, what are the educational capabilities that we need to put in place, where's the innovation that we're putting in place in workforce training that I think we need to give a very heavy emphasis on. So, you know, I don't, let me be clear, I don't want to minimize the impact on everyone that COVID is causing, but I would just emphasize that the upper middle class is generally going to do okay. And everybody else, I think it's going to be a real struggle. And what is very tough, obviously, of people in poverty, below the poverty line, lower middle class people who, in fact, really felt they had arrived, and they see their whole life being destroyed.
You've talked about, so we take that point, Ken, and I want to pick up on the threads of a couple of questions that were in here. The responsibilities that organizations of business have, and talked about that, and the partnership, the leadership or partnership with governmental entities, whether it's at the federal or state level. Do you see seedlings of hope that business may take a leadership role in some of the educational efforts that you've talked about here, which are really the foundation for so much of what, you know, what needs to happen here?
I do see some seedlings. Let me give one teaser, and is next week there'll be an announcement. And to me, what's very exciting about the announcement is it's a group of companies coming together in a very specific way to, and I'm being purposely broad here, to improve the job prospects, but actually committing to jobs for a key segment of the US population. And I think what is very important is this was something that has been created after the horrible murder of George Floyd. And it's been amazing to see this. Now, it's not going to be 100 companies. It'll probably be 30, 40 companies. But I believe it's going to take off in a big way. It's not being done as a philanthropic organization. It's being done, this is good for business. Here's what we're going to do. But what you're going to have is a range of companies across various industries aligned against a common objective and a commitment against this objective for 10 years. And that private-public partnership, as we know, these problems are not going to be solved in 12, 24 months or 4 years. And so I also know that there are some opportunities that are being focused on the educational side, and of adopting schools, working with private-public partnerships. But obviously this has to be multiplied dramatically. But one of the things, Clayton, that I'm encouraged by, and we talked about this a month ago are the number of CEOs that really feel they've got to make a difference in the broader society. And what I hope, and I've said to them, is do not lose that sense of urgency. Keep it going.
All right, taking that, let's pick up on a question here from Catherine Finnegan. With a renewed focus on diversity.
Hello. Yeah.
With a renewed focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and with your history and current role, lived experience in corporate America, how can and should the business community step up? And let me take the liberty of adding a second piece to that question. I know because I was one of those that called you, but when business leaders called you in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd and said, we have to do things differently here, what advice were you giving them about what to do and what not to do and how to think about this work? So Catherine's question gets to how and should business community step up? And I was thinking about the advice you were giving to corporate leaders.
Yeah, so first, the issue of race, as we know, is America's great unsolved problem. And the question of diversity, what I feel very strongly about is I want to be part of an institution, I want to be part of a country that doesn't just accept people, but embraces people. And one of the things I said to CEOs, and people confronted this issue with different levels of awareness, is how self-aware are you of what the issues are? What are you doing to educate yourself? What are the conversations that you've had? What happens in a private setting when someone says something in a derogatory way about a diverse person? Have you always spoken up, or did you let it pass? Because there's both individual responsibility, collective responsibility, and institutional responsibility. So part of it, what I've said is, as you, the leader, is the question is, what do you really believe? How fervent is your belief? Or is this just an issue that your people are agitating and you feel you need to do something? Because that's not going to bring about real change. So I think this awareness issue is very important. I think second is it's critical to identify what are some key initiatives that will really bring about change. What are you doing to increase representation? Are you simply employing the same strategies year after year? And you're saying, well, the pipeline, I'm just not getting enough people in the pipeline. You're the one in charge of the pipe. And so if your focus is, you've got to think of some innovative strategies to make that happen. And you've got to hold yourself and your people accountable. But I think it's very, very important that people understand and believe this is the culture that I want at my institution or my company. And they got to have a gut check there. Because frankly, if they can't take that step, I'm not confident that the other steps are going to result in progress. And then I think very importantly, what I've said to every CEO is, what's your long-term commitment? So I understand you gave X amount of dollars here and you're going to try to increase representation here. 10 years from now, where are you going to be? And very importantly, obviously, where are you going to be in a year? But I want to make sure that resolve is there. So I think that this is a very challenging issue because it goes to values and beliefs. And I don't think you can separate that out from the concrete steps that you have to take.
So let me ask a follow-on question, Ken, that relates to the work you did when you were here as a senior in your senior thesis, which I mentioned earlier, The Black Man at Bowdoin, a history of Black members of our community, Black men. What motivated you to write that? And as you know, I've read it a couple of times, and it's very honest, as it should be, and direct. You faced some opposition from the administration in their desire to have you write it at the time, but also some support from other quarters as well. But what motivated you to write that? And then how did your experience at Bowdoin, the intellectual experience of writing that, and the rest of your experience here, how does that inform who you are today and how you think about these issues?
Yeah, so let me say, with all the challenges and issues of going to college in the 70s, I had a great experience at Bowdoin. And at that time, Bowdoin was, we were a small school, but we had representation at that time on a relative basis against other schools, a more diverse campus. We still were separated in a lot of respects. There wasn't enough interaction with different people, but I found it a very intellectually invigorating place, and I learned a lot about life. And for me, I loved history because I love trying to understand motivations and serendipity affecting major outcomes. And so for me, writing my honors thesis on the Black Man at Bowdoin was one. Bowdoin for a long time was held out as having the first Black who graduated from a white college. And only, I think, starting in the 50s did Amherst and Williams admit that they actually had some Blacks 1 or 2 years before Bowdoin. But Bowdoin at least stood, never denied, and in fact trumpeted the fact. And so I was really impressed with that. But then as I did more research, I found out that Bowdoin didn't have another Black student until 1910. And then what was amazing was to follow some of the individual lives of these students. And what was interesting is, I think something like 3/4 of the Blacks, only around, I think it was 8 or 10, graduated Phi Beta Kappa. And they had trouble finding jobs at that time. And so to see how they had to face the prejudice, discrimination, and bias out there, and then also on a relative basis to see how Bowdoin treated them, which generally was not very good. And part of the way I feel now are the missed opportunities that America has had to bring about real change. And I think there's a famous African-American historian, John Hope Franklin, that said he felt he had a responsibility to tell the unvarnished truth. And I actually obviously took a pretty tough stand on Bowdoin, but what it didn't change for me, despite some figures in the administration who didn't want me to write it, the faculty, they couldn't have been more supportive and more helpful and more excited. And I think what is important, and something that I feel very strongly and has motivated me, is to bring about progress is about a struggle, is about confronting things. And I go back to, you know, my mantra that I took from Napoleon, that I think you got to define reality to give hope. And so the reality of Bowdoin at that time, and where Bowdoin is today, and where Bowdoin can go, and Bowdoin is not perfect today, I still have a lot of hope.
I think that's a wonderful place to end, Ken. We're at time here, and I want to thank, we didn't get to every question, but we got to strains of every question. And I really want to thank our alums and community members who are here for those questions. And I want to thank you, Ken, for once again giving your time and being so thoughtful and honest. Your experiences and wisdom are something that we really benefit from and enjoy enormously hearing from you. And we're all grateful, and I am grateful. So thank you. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much. Great to be with everyone virtually, and I look forward to the day we can be with each other in person.
Amen. Thank you.
All right.